This time bringing you a video on multiclassing for the upcoming title Baldur's Gate 3, which is launching in just a few weeks. One of the more interesting things you can do in building a character for that game is picking from several different classes, combining them together to make something unique, which is of course known as multiclassing. But I want to start this video off with a couple of qualifiers. We know that multiclassing is coming to the launch version of Baldur's Gate 3. It was confirmed during their latest panel from Hell. However, they didn't give a ton of details on it, merely that it was coming with the launch version and that you'll be able to freely respec your character, so if you mess up or make a mistake, you'll be able to experiment with multiclassing very freely. I mention this because what we don't know is if they're going to be homebrewing any specific rules around it, outside of the rules that already come with the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set in regards to multiclassing, which we're about to go over here shortly. I just wanted to mention that because they did not go over it in explicit detail, we don't know exactly if there's going to be any minor changes to how things work to make things simpler, like for instance the relatively complicated spellcasting situation for multiclassing multiple spellcasters. That said, with them providing literally zero information on this besides the fact that it's coming in their final showcase when they had an opportunity to show off basically everything else about the game, leads me to believe it's probably going to be added in as is, but I do acknowledge there might be changes. In that regard, I think what you're most likely to see in terms of changes for Baldur's Gate 3 and multiclassing is not so much the system of multiclassing, but rather the classes themselves. You see, Baldur's Gate 3 has actually house-ruled and homebrewed a few things for various classes, including subclasses and even the races you can play as. So because of this, those small changes might have bigger impacts on specific multiclasses that might be popular elsewhere, say in the tabletop version for instance, but beyond that we will just have to wait and see. But the first big part of explaining the rules of how multiclassing works, I think needs to be emphasized, is simply the cost. Multiclassing is not free in the sense that you can just combine classes together and have an awesome class. You see, the cost here is an opportunity cost. You only have so many levels. In the case of Baldur's Gate 3, that will be 12 levels, and splitting them between various classes means you won't get the full effect and abilities from a specific class you were playing as. In some cases, this can be advantageous if you're after a specific thing. In other cases, you can actively harm your character. That is to say, make them less effective. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, multiclassing is one of the few places you could make what I would consider a genuine mistake in regards to building your character. Because it's absolutely possible to leave yourself with a character that is weaker than when you started. So what you constantly have to weigh here is the benefit of what you are gaining from a multiclass versus what you are losing from not continuing forward in your main class. Probably one of the most significant instances of this is the potential loss of an ability score improvement or a feat. Which, to explain, I first have to explain a basic point of multiclassing. Multiclassing in 5th edition D&D works with what I like to call a class point system. Basically, every time your character levels up, what you are gaining is a character level. You can spend that character level on any of the available classes that you meet the prerequisites for. In most cases, this will just be the same class as always. But to multiclass, you simply put that point in an available class for you. In order for a class to be available for multiclassing, you have to meet the ability score requirements of the class you have and the class you are wanting. Now the magic number here is 13. The required ability score, at least for the tabletop version, is always 13, and simply what ability score that is changes depending on the class. So for instance, a barbarian requires strength 13, a bard requires charisma 13. I should have a table up on screen here for you. Now the advancement for each of these classes that you put points into is largely separate, outside of a few specific things like your hit points and your experience points total. So the experience point cost of going from level 2 to 3 will always be the same regardless of how many classes you have multiclassed. Your proficiency bonus is also based on your total character level and not the individual classes. However, there are a few specific things that combine in a sort of half and half way. For instance, when it comes to proficiencies, you only gain some of the proficiencies of the new class. Again, I should have a table here for you so you can see. And in the case of sorcerer and wizard, you don't gain any proficiencies at all. I mentioned that one of the big things you could potentially lose out on here is an ability score improvement or a feat. Every 4 levels a class gains roughly, up until you hit like level 19, so it won't be a factor in BG3, you gain an ability score improvement, which is the opportunity to increase the ability scores you have with a total of 2 points, either increasing 2 of them by 1 or 1 by 2, or you can take a feat instead of this. But as I mentioned, this is based on the levels of the class you have. So normally at level 12, if you have 12 levels in a class, you have 3 ability score improvements. However, if you only have, say, 6 and 6 of 2 different classes, then you've only gained 2 of those ability score improvements. But even this can be worked around if you're clever with it, as rogues get an extra ability score improvement at level 10, which is sort of off cycle for everyone else. Or something like a fighter, who I believe gets an extra one at level 6. All that to tell you that the opportunity cost of multiclassing is always something that should be kept in mind, and there are absolutely a few popular choices that we'll get into towards the end of the video, but the first thing on your mind when it comes to multiclassing should always be, is this worth it? Now from there, I want to talk about some of the things that you actually gain from the extra class. I already talked about this a little bit, but to go over it again just to be thorough, you do not get all of the proficiencies from the new class. This is important for classes that like start with heavy armor on their own, but only get medium if you multiclass into them. You also don't get any additional saving throw proficiencies from your new class as well. Basically just what you see here in this table. The exception to this is if the class you're multiclassing into is a subclass that you want or has a specific thing going for it that is unique to that subclass, and then it will transfer over, because otherwise it wouldn't be any good. But there are a few other things that also don't stack. These are mainly unarmored defense, extra attack, and extra uses of channel divinity. So if you have multiple classes giving you extra attack, that will not stack together unless that feature specifically says so, like the fighter's version does, I believe. Which is similar for barbarians or monks' unarmored defense, which allows them to get more AC based on their ability scores. Stuff like that also doesn't stack. Now, by far the most complicated thing about combining classes, though, is multi-classing spellcasters, because this is separated into determining the spells that you know and can prepare versus the spell slots that are available to you. Also, what ability score those spells are being casted from. So first up, the complicated part is the spell slots available to you. That is to say, the number of times you can cast spells a day. To do this, you first have to determine your spell casting level. Unless you're using a paladin or a ranger, this is very straightforward. You just add them together. That is to say, the levels in each class. However, paladins and rangers only get half their class rounded down for this, because they are half casters and don't get as many spell slots as normal. So once you've determined this level, you can use this chart to tell you exactly how many spell slots you'll actually have for each level of spell. Each of the spells you cast with those slots has to be used with the casting ability for the class that gave you that spell. So if you're using a sorcerer, you would use charisma for the spells with which you cast that are from that class. But that gets a little more complicated, because while the spell casting level will give you spell slots of a higher level, there's a good chance you won't know any spells of that level. However, what you can do here is upcast your lower level spells as higher level spell slots, giving them more benefits or extra effects. So basically you're trading off higher level known spells for lower level casts, upcasted to be stronger. And if that wasn't complicated enough, that's before we even talk about warlocks. Warlocks work a bit differently than regular spellcasters because they use what is called pact magic. Because of this, warlock get additional spell slots just in addition to however else you've gotten them, with the multi-classing simply allowing you to interchangeably use your warlock spells versus the spells from other classes. So you could use your warlock spell slots to cast sorcerer abilities or whatever. Now, the upside of this being a video game is that the game is likely going to handle all the math of that for you. You don't actually have to figure any of that out yourself. The most important thing for a video game to keep in mind is probably what your spellcasting ability is, because it's best not to mix and match them. So an easy example is like a wisdom spellcaster and a charisma spellcaster. The spells that I cast from that class are going to be using the appropriate spellcasting modifier from that class, and if it's not the same stat, you might potentially have some issues there. Now, as opposed to multi-classing spellcasters, multi-classing martially focused classes like a barbarian and a fighter is really simple. Basically, just keep in mind that a couple things like extra attack do not stack, and you'll also want to keep in mind, again, the opportunity cost of what you're giving up in levels if you were to go into something else. Now, from here, I want to talk about a few of, I would say, common multi-classes that you're likely to see, things that go well together, things that are just generally popular. It's not necessary to do these by any means, but if you're looking for a place to start, these might help you out, so I figured I would include them. First and foremost, 2 levels in Fighter. 2 levels in Fighter gives you access to an ability called Action Surge, which lets you take an additional action in combat, and because 5th edition D&D is simply so tied to the action economy and how classes are taking their turns, etc., this is just universally useful. Action Surge is, because of the action economy, one of the better abilities you can get, period. And then you combine that with the medium armor proficiency you'll get simply by being a fighter as a multi-class, and this can pair especially well with casters who get both the action surge and the extra armor. Of course, at the expense of spell slots, but if you're only worried about going to level 12, maybe that's not an issue for you. Another common variation of roughly that same thing is what is called a Sorkadin, which is a paladin and a sorcerer. This one is fun because there's actually quite a few different ways you can do it. You can lean into the defensive features of the paladin while still focusing on primarily being a caster, or you can focus on the melee features of the paladin while using the sorcerer spell slots you're going to be getting as a way to cast extra divine smites on your melee attacks. And there's a lot of fun ways to combine Paladin and Sorcerer to do something that can be unique and play the way you want it to play. That's a very popular one. You'll see people use that a lot. Another one that is popular for kind of the same reason is the Lockadin, which is the same thing but like with a warlock instead of a sorcerer. This is because warlocks can recharge their spell slots on a short rest, which will then apply here, and then you can use those divine smites. That said, this was really common with a Warlock's Hexblade, but that particular subclass isn't available in BG3, so I don't know exactly how fun this will be in Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, but you can still make use of the spell slots recharging the way they do here regardless. Another interesting one is combining Druid Wild Shapes with Barbarian Rages, as Wild Shape Druids get a bunch of extra HP, and then Barbarians, when using their Rage powers, also take half damage from certain sources, which can make them an incredible tank. But this one really comes down to how BG3 handles the relevant AC calculations that go into deciding how much armor class you actually have while doing this, but could potentially be a fun way to play a tank. But really, that's just the tip of the iceberg for what you can do here, but I don't want this video to go on forever. But luckily, with the free respecking that's coming with the game as well, you'll be able to mix and match and try all this as you please through the game, and I imagine many people will want to experiment with it. But do keep in mind 5th edition D&D's been around a while. There are plenty of guides on mixing and matching particular things, so there's plenty of ways to look up exactly what could potentially go well together or to generate some ideas for yourself as well. That said, that's pretty much everything I've got for you today. I hope you found this video useful. I hope it was informative for you, especially if you're only playing the game and you're not familiar with multi-classing potentially. I hope you learned something. But again, do keep in mind there might be some minor variations to how this is implemented in the launch version of the game. All of that said though, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May